And so, Antonia.
Oh yes, what do I do?
Oh, hang on. That's fine. There we are.
Yeah.
Carry on.
Okay.
Sorry about that. So Antonia's latest book is called The Case of the Married Woman, Caroline Norton, a 19th century heroine who wanted justice for women. And this is the book. It's a handsome book. And I wanted to perhaps, if first of all, Caroline Norton is not the most well-known 19th century figure. And I wondered, Antonia, if you could first of all tell us a little bit about Caroline Norton, and also perhaps what it was that drew you to write about her.
Well, I'll start with the second question first, because I think it explains something about it. I wanted to do a book about a law case. I've always been fascinated by the law. And in a way, I think you can see there's a connection between a barrister and a biographer. Somehow a biographer is doing something of the same thing, perhaps not paid quite so well, having a son-in-law and a son who are barristers. But anyway, I wanted to do it. I had a dim memory of this law case, but very little, just a dim memory. And one of my granddaughters was reading for the bar and wanted to do some work to keep herself going. And so I said, find the trial, print it out, which she did. And the moment I read the trial, I was absolutely hooked. Well, I'll now go back, and that's where I wanted to do the book. But I knew very little about Caroline Norton. And indeed, part of the fun of doing the book for me was that people, this is not Mary Queen of Scots or Marie Antoinette. I hope I've introduced people to her. Well, she was born Sheridan, granddaughter of Richard Brinsley Sheridan, a playwright and politician, and beautiful, but not as beautiful as her elder sister, Georgiana, and in her own merry words, I'm the clever one, not as nice as her sister Helen, who became Lady Dufferin, but they were three graces. And when she was quite young, sort of schoolgirl, she attracted someone called George Norton, who was determined to marry her. And she did marry him. That's what girls did. She was 19, and he was the younger, well, the brother of a lord. Didn't have a great deal of money, but I mean, he was perfectly all right. He was a Tory MP. Everything seemed set fair. And she set up a sort of salon in London, in Storey's Gate, Westminster, good for an MP. Everything was fine. And she began her salon. The thing is, Caroline was a very lively character, the Sheridan blood, the Irish blood. She liked jokes. She was very flirtatious, and I use the word deliberately, just loved flirting. She had wicked eyes, huge eyes, dark eyebrows, and black eyelashes, wonderful black hair. And she was really having just a merry time, and everybody enjoyed her company and her jokes. And George Norton began to get rather annoyed, and he like jealous people do, his obsession or love for her, didn't see why other people should like her as well. Anyhow, he set her to work. He said, why don't you get me some more money? There's a magistrate's job going. Why don't you ask the Prime Minister, who was about to be Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, see if he has it. I think he was then at the Home Office. Why don't you see what you can do? So he came round, Lord Melbourne, who was a widower and 30 years older than her, but still an attractive man. And they formed a flirtatious friendship. I won't say more than that. And gradually people said, well, if you want to ask Melbourne to dinner, you better ask that Caroline Norton. And George Norton got sourer and sourer, and eventually prodded by his high Tory brother and friend, in order to get at Melbourne, who was not a high Tory, he sued him for criminal conversation, in other words, adultery with his wife. And this was the case of the married woman. And Jane, although Caroline was the chief defender, really, it was her, she was the one who committed adultery, because Lord Melbourne was not married. She was not represented in court, not present in court, just told to we often went to Hampton Court, where her mother had a grace and favour apartment. And so there was this incredible trial of evidence, some of which I couldn't say on a family television, the servants and sheets and that sort of thing. And exactly, not suitable for family television. And lots of evidence of servants coming in. And it wasn't until until Melbourne's council began to examine the servants, who all turned out to have been sacked, often for drink, that the thing became much more dicey. And finally, the judge said, we are distinguishing between familiarity and intimacy, by which he meant sex. And he found that they were innocent. Now, were they innocent? My readers have divided very much into those who've said, oh, come on, Antonia, of course they did it. And those who accepted my own view that they went pretty far, but not the whole way. Anyway, the judge took my line, or I took the judge's line. And then, this is the point really of the book, legally, George Norton flung his innocent wife out of the house, legally stopped her from seeing her 3 children under 7, and legally lived off the copyright of her works because she was a writer. Isn't that incredible?
Oh, it's terrible, isn't it?
Isn't it?
And
we
I
can't
think
believe it.
no, you can't believe it. And I think what sort of drives the book on is the fact that Caroline refuses to accept defeat, doesn't she? I mean, she refuses to see the law case as the end of the story.
Yeah, she didn't lie down and wail.
No, not at all. And so she campaigns, and she's incredibly sort of admirable and busy, and she's engaged in this lifelong feud with her husband, which you wonderfully describe.
Well, I mean, who can really blame her? Because, I repeat, she'd been found innocent to have your children taken away legally. And then one of them, the youngest, died in Scotland because not enough care. He was allowed to go riding alone on a pony, fell off, was allowed to get septicemia, and died before she could get there, calling for her. No wonder she had a feud with her husband, you know. I mean, but what she did, as you rightly said, instead of wailing, she began to lobby for the infant custody bill, which meant that a mother had a right to see her child. And it seems so extraordinary to us, and then it was passed in 1839, and then she lobbied for other things.
Yes, you say somewhere that that it was loss and motherhood, not ambition, that drove her work. I mean, that she didn't want fame particularly. I mean, she got it, I think, but that she was just driven by her sort of, the tragedy of her marriage and her children, to campaign for, rights for women in an incredibly pioneering way.
Yes, the rights of women, to protect women from this kind of thing, that women had rights to see their children, rights to have their property. And I think I quote Milton, famous The Spur, and said it wasn't the spur with her. Mind you, I think she wasn't averse to fame. She quite liked writing letters to the Times. When her husband wrote a letter to the Times, she wrote a letter back. She infuriated her sisters. And I can see if she was my sister, I have a very nice sister who would never write to the Times like that. But I can see it might have been, she was uppish, jokey. I mean, there was a scene described, I think the French ambassador described it, where she was kicking Melbourne's hat, at a party. I mean, she was high-spirited.
Attention-seeking, perhaps.
Yes, I think attention-seeking.
Yeah. So would you describe her as a feminist? Is that the right word for Caroline Norton, do you think?
Well, I think we've got to be very careful about using our words about them, the people who lived once and don't know. And I say at the beginning of my book that I think we should judge her by her values and not ours. And she was about 20 years older than the first serious feminists like Barbara Baduchon, people like that. And she paid lip service to the old theories. She said, oh yes, women were created inferior to men. Did Caroline Norton think she was inferior to George Norton? She jolly well didn't. She didn't think she was inferior to anyone, but she wasn't interested in what we can now see was so important, like votes, you know. She was interested in, particularly interested, for instance, in slave women who had a very high death rate, keen, of course, on the emancipation of slaves. And she went for the practical. I mean, in her novels, she wrote a lot about, well, disabled people. There was a disabled girl, as we would now call her, she called crippled, you know, and a girl of mixed race, as we would now say, was the product of a non-marriage between a Caribbean girl and an Englishman. You know, she went for the disadvantaged.
Yeah, and in some ways, she's actually a very modern character, isn't she, I think? I mean, I admire the way that she's all the way through all these dramas and terrible things happening. She goes on writing. She goes on writing her books, and she's able to sort of earn her living, at least when her husband doesn't take it away, the money.
Yeah.
But I mean, that is really very sort of striking, and it comes out very clearly in your book just how much of a sort of professional woman she was, really.
She was, like perhaps like women of my generation, where it was very marked the ones who worked, you know, went to offices, but ones who, I mean, did lots of things, but didn't actually, weren't professionals. She was a professional, quite right.
Mm-hmm. And she did make enough money to earn her living. I mean,
yes, and then she bought a house in Chesterfield Street, number 3, opposite, just off Curzon Street.
Big.
And this year, English Heritage decided to unveil 6 plaques to women. Very good idea. Beginning with Princess Diana's house as a girl, her flat, and then completely nothing to do with me. They decided to do one for Caroline Norton, and they asked me to unveil it. Jane, it was the proudest moment of my life. The only thing is that, you know, what with the props, the specs, you know, the mask, the stick, the pulley, supposing I get them in the wrong order and sort of hit the plaque with my stick and sort of pull off the pulley. And there were 3 sort of twisted pulleys, and I was carefully instructed. And then, of course, I pulled the wrong one. But luckily, nothing happened. And the next one, there was a swoosh of red velvet. And I was able to point out that when she earned the money for the house, her brother had to sign the lease, because as a woman, she couldn't. So it was a perfect choice of English Heritage.
And it answers the question which I had, which is, why does she matter today? She does matter for those, for you know, she anticipated modern women in so many respects. I thought that I particularly enjoyed the section of the book that talks about her sort of later life.
Yes.
And could you tell us a little bit about that, about what Caroline did?
Well, she is very beautiful. Artists loved her. She was painted by lots of artists, and there is a famous picture still in the House of Lords in an archway where it's on the back of my book. Can I?
It's just over here.
Oh, I've got it.
If you turn it, can you see it?
Yeah.
That's hers, the figure of justice. When they redid the House of Lords after the fire of 1834, Daniel Maclise painted her. You can see there's a slave with his shackles off at the bottom.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And you see her looking rather baleful with the scales of justice. Anyway, she and she liked that, and she liked symbolizing justice. But that was one thing she did, and I think Benjamin Hayden was rather in love with her. But she then did definitely begin to have affairs. I mean, she was separated, you know, she had nothing to lose, and I think had an affair with Sidney Herbert, the patron of Florence Nightingale, who died very sadly young. And then all the time, there was a handsome young Scot called Sir William Stirling, who was 10 years younger than her. And she met first in Portugal, I think. He was very interested in Spanish painting, wrote a great book about it. And over the years, he got married to Lady Anna, and she was allowed to bring her grandchildren to, because she who had not been able to bring up her children was able to bring up her grandchildren. And she used to go and stay in Scotland. And then when tragically Lady Anna died, age 40 of some fit, and Caroline begins to get ill and needs help, the person who comes to her help is William Stirling, and they have a romantic, very late marriage. She's lying on her sofa. She can't even go to a church. And she ends her life, I find it so romantic, ends her life, what she'd never been, a happily married woman.
I know, it's lovely, isn't it? At 69 or something, she marries him.
Yeah, she was 61.
You sort of feel that, you know, that this is, as you say, a wonderful end to her life. And also, because the other thing that was so tragic was her children, to whom she was devoted. And they all had miserable lives in one way or another, and rather short ones too. Her sons.
Well, there was a curse of consumption in the Sheridan family. And one of her sons, who was a diplomat, died of consumption. And then her son married a Sicilian peasant, and that marriage didn't work. But her two grandchildren, Richard and Carlotta for Caroline, obviously, Richard and Carlotta, because the parents' marriage got into trouble. Caroline did a lot of looking after them, taking them to Scotland, as I said, and teaching them. And so I think it's very pleasing, like the late marriage, that the grandchildren were a great joy to her.
Yeah.
And the present Lord Grantley is descended from Richard directly.
She was very keen on the title, wasn't she? Rather unexpectedly. Not
well,
very radical.
I was never, that's always said. But to be quite honest, I never saw, I looked for, you know, I looked for evidence. And it was said that her husband, what was it? He died before his brother. He was going to inherit the title from his brother, who was childless. Her husband deliberately died before his brother. So she was never Lady Grantley. But I think she was quite happy being Caroline Norton.
Well, I think it's a great read, and I recommend it to everybody. It really is an extraordinary, a wonderful account of an extraordinary life. And I just wondered if we could just, as I said, look a little bit at your incredible career as a biographer, and just looking at the sort of list, a major biography every 4 or 5 years for quite a lot of years. And that's not counting all the crime novels that you've written and the memoirs. And I think it's right to say that your breakthrough book was the biography of Mary, Queen of Scots, published in 1969, which was a huge bestseller. And I just wonder if you can tell us a bit how that book changed your life.
Well, it certainly changed my life, because I'd never had a penny to my name. That was extraordinary. Nobody expected it.
Oh, really?
No, I was paid £1,000 advance. And, well, lucky publisher is all I can say. No, what? I'd had a childhood passion for her, a passion for history. And my mother, Elizabeth Longford, came to see me and my children, her grandchildren, one day. She'd written a very successful book, if I may say so in your presence, on Queen Victoria. And she was looking for...
It's a great book.
She was looking for a new subject.
Yeah.
And she said, oh, my agent thinks I should do Mary, Queen of Scots. And I froze with horror. I can still remember freezing. I was sitting on this sofa where I'm unfrozen now. And I said, you can't do that. She's my Mary, Queen of Scots. And my mother said, oh, well, I'll do Wellington, and Philip Magnus can do Edward VII. You know, seemed to not realise what she'd said. And so I decided to do it. I rang up her agent and I did it. And nobody expected to do anything. The publisher halved the print run shortly before publication. And I mean, it was just one of those phenomena. How lovely, how lucky I was. In America, they wrote a letter, the kind of letter we want to frame, saying this arid scholarly work will be of little interest to US readers. When it had been #2 on the bestseller list for 7 months, in a rather uncharming way, I wished that reader, I wished that he realized. Anyway, it was a great success. And then I was so fortunate, because to be able to do something I really wanted to do and it to be successful, what greater happiness in life, you know.
Absolutely. But on the other hand, I think a very early success puts a bit of pressure on you with the next ones, doesn't it?
Well, I chose to go my way, to do it my way, as somebody once said, because everybody wanted me to do something as near Mary, Queen of Scots as possible, sort of Bonnie Prince Charlie, or an extraordinary idea, Marie Antoinette. Who would ever write about Marie Antoinette? And I deliberately went and wrote about Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell, in order to show that I think that I wasn't just a pretty brain. I think I was determined not to be marked. I mean, it seems an odd decision now, but that's, I wanted not to be sort of pigeonholed.
Yeah. But you went on, and not just Cromwell, there's a whole sort of gallery of Stuarts and James I and Tudors, Charles II, and then the 6 wives of Henry VIII. So obviously that was a field where you felt comfortable, the 16th and 17th century.
At the time. But actually, I did do one book, which I still think is probably my best book anyway, a sort of pathfinding book called The Weaker Vessel, about 17th century English women. And this was a time when women wouldn't be in the index, you know. It really did very little in this country and was a bestseller in America, who were ahead.
Sorry.
No, I'm very proud of that book.
I mean, that book won an important prize, I think, didn't it?
It won the Wolfson.
Yes, exactly. That can't get higher than that. And looking back, would that be the book that you're proudest of writing?
Well, possibly, because to do a book, you know, I remember saying to Harold when I came down to lunch the first day, you know, there's no beginning and no end, and 52% of the population. I was used to a nice decapitation, you know, something like that. But biography, as I don't need to tell you, has got a natural structure. And it was partly influenced by Keith Thomas's wonderful book, Religion and the Decline of Magic. That was a very important book to me. And I thought a book could be like that. And so I had to go.
And so that book brought you quite closer than perhaps in other books to the academy, to academic history. And no.
Well, the thing is, Jane, that my father was an academic in my childhood. He was a don at Christ Church, and I went to Oxford, and I very early decided I didn't want to be a don, and I didn't want to marry a don. Well, Oxford didn't want me to be a don, and no Oxford don wanted to marry me, so it wasn't very difficult. But you know, sometimes you want to lead another kind of life from the life where you were brought up.
Absolutely. So, and I'm particularly impressed looking at what you've written at the range. I mean, after all those very strong books, Tudors and Stuarts, 16th, 17th century Britain, you then shift abruptly to France, and write about Marie Antoinette in 2001, and Love and Louis XIV. And that presumably means dealing with an awful lot of difficult French documents, difficult both in the actual writing, to reading them, and in the language, and that's an extraordinary, breadth of skill.
Well, we were spending a lot of time in France. Harold was direct. Yeah. One of my daughters married a Frenchman and had twins in France. It just came to me. I was going to have dinner with my goddaughter and tell her about her A-levels, what to do. And suddenly I thought, I know, I'm going to do Marie Antoinette. This is the time I'm going to do it. And I arrived and lectured her about Marie Antoinette, poor girl. And I went back and looked in my diary. And it was October the 16th, the day she was executed, when I always go to Mass and offer a Mass for her now. Yeah. And so I feel some sort of, but after Marie Antoinette, which I adored doing, I loved going to Versailles. And actually, I loved working in French libraries. It was very difficult to get in. They treated me like a schoolgirl with pretensions. And when I tried to mutter, I'd written 1 or 2 books, they said, have you ever tried to get them published? Well, what do you say in French? Memus.
Did your book, did it get translated into French?
Good question. The French don't like Marie Antoinette, la reine méchante. And it did only when Sophia Coppola made a film out of my book.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yes. Yeah. And I don't think it did particularly well in France.
Oh, and then, sorry.
It did so well and still does all around the world.
I love it. Still in print, excellent. And what about Love and Louis XIV?
Well, after Marie Antoinette, I wrote The Gunpowder Plot. I wrote The Gunpowder Plot before.
So back to Britain.
Yes. No, I'm wrong. I wrote The Gunpowder Plot before Marie Antoinette, 1906. And then, as you say, quite rightly, after Marie Antoinette, Louis XIV, I'd always loved, ever since I read Dumas obsessively as a child. Since I read The Count of Monte Cristo, I wanted to write in that period. And I had a very good time.
And so, more recently, you have moved into, as we've seen with Caroline Norton, into the 19th century, not just Caroline Norton, but you've also written 2 incredibly vivid accounts of political crises, of something like the Great Reform Bill. I think we all thought that had been completely destroyed as a fascinating subject by GCSE and whatever syllabuses. But you were able, with your book about the Great Reform Bill, to make it, as I'm sure it was at the time, a really exciting political drama. And yes.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I felt it was a drama. I think its subtitle, I think, is The Drama of the Great Reform Bill. Yeah. In between, you see, shortly after Louis XIV, Harold died, my husband, and I then wrote a memoir, Must You Go, about our lives together. And it was during that memoir and writing it, which was such a sort of change in every way, that I suddenly got interested in the Great Reform Bill. And of course, I focused on Charles Grey, loved Lord Grey. And a friend of mine said at the time, it was a good joke, that my book should really be called 50 Shades of Grey. But then when I was writing it, I'd researched it when I was writing it, I suddenly realized that I should have been writing about Catholic emancipation, because I am a Catholic all along. And that was absolutely riveting, because it took me to Ireland, where my ancestors lived, my brother lives. And so it was a natural progression.
But where did it come from, the ambition to write about a completely different period of history, again, you touched the
changed, you see. My whole life had changed.
Yes. Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I didn't sit down and say I want to change, but I think that is why.
And so here we are with Caroline Norton. Now, and I just wonder if you could, if you know what the next book will be. Sorry, Percy's misbehaving.
Well, I am working on a book, but please forgive me. Please forgive me, doggy. Please forgive me. No. I don't talk about work in progress. It's a sort of superstitious thing, because you can talk the book away. And I think I like to keep it and then sort of feel the need to communicate when I've done it.
I can see that, absolutely.
I can't. I'm afraid you've gone.
Sorry, I muted me and the dog. Well, look, thank you very much indeed for that. And I think perhaps now we ought to see if there's any questions. Nicholas, over to you.
Well, actually, we've got a very reticent audience, as so often happens. So perhaps, Antonia, can I ask you what your sources were for this book? Did Caroline Norton leave a lot of letters, for example? Where were the sources?
This is one of the great advantages of today is the fact that Hansard is online. And I find reading Hansard online a great pleasure in life, as opposed to reading, well, in the British Library, I think in humanities, you have to sort of get it down and it's awful, but if you can go online, you can be in control. And I have many happy days reading Hansard and speeches, appalling speeches by sort of fearful right-wing people, saying that if women could leave their husbands and still have access to their children, it was encouraging adultery, anti-Christian. So Hansard was very important to me because a lot of it takes place House of Commons or House of Lords. And then there are good manuscripts. Lord Melbourne lived in Hertfordshire, really, and there you have very good Centre of Archives house and other, you find your way archives and find out what you want. And then if you have the sense to write down the figures correctly, which I don't always in the right order, but I like that. I like doing manuscript research.
Did a strong sense of Caroline Norton's personality come through her letters? Yes,
definitely. And her letters. And there is a very good edition of her letters, selected letters, and really important by Ross Belson and Murray Mulvey Roberts, which actually came out during when I was working. It was slightly complicated at the time when I was actually writing the book, but enormous value to scholars.
Questions have been coming in now, okay. I'm glad to say. Ariane Banks asks what kind of books Caroline Norton wrote, and Sarah Anderson, a question I might put as an addendum to that is, have they been reprinted? Have they survived in any way?
Caroline Norton's books I read mainly in the first place from the London Library, which is very good about 19th century things. They're novels which are quite long, as novels were in the 19th century. I think the best one is Old Sir Douglas, which was actually her last. But they're all quite good, quite dramatic plots, as I said, including disabled people or mixed race. They're not just confined to one particular layer of society. And then nowadays you can also get them printed online and even get versions of them, particularly printed in America and sent. So you can read them reproduced, which can lead to some odd sort of blots and mistakes in the printing, but it's all useful, so one can sort of generally kind of immerse oneself.
Did she get good reviews? I mean, was she a critical success?
Yes, quite good reviews. It's rather nice. I think one reviewer said, "No lady should ever be given a bad review." This lady, yes, that's a very good sentiment indeed. I want to put a footnote saying the author thoroughly agrees with this, but I thought it might provoke people. And she did write for magazines, which ladies did. There were lots and lots of magazines, and edited them.
Yeah.
Sort of chatty magazines. We don't really quite have them equivalent of, I don't know, Twittering and that sort of thing.
Sophie asked where you first heard about Caroline Norton. Do you remember?
I can't. I think probably reading about the Sheridans. My late friend Linda Kelly wrote a life of her grandfather, and I am Anglo-Irish. I think reading about the Sheridans, she was born Sheridan, probably, but it was the dim memory of the law case which turned me. But I had no idea what a rich and many-layered character she was at all.
Did you find out things about the case that you hadn't expected?
Well, everything about the case. I didn't expect really at my work to be trying to decide what was foreplay. That's not quite how you think of it, spend your time. Solemnly.
Was that a word they used then?
No, but I not have thought just what words I could use.
Right.
I think I'd better leave you to read the book. See whether you think.
No, we're not quite at the watershed. Nicolette Jones asks, was she allowed to attend her children's funerals?
She was allowed. Willie, the little boy who died, she was allowed to attend it. I should hope so too, because she did arrive in Scotland, where they were. She was sent for, but she arrived too late. She'd been sent for too late. Yes, I think funerals, absolutely. She didn't stay in the same house as her husband, but it was terrible. And then the second son who died in Paris. She was there. He'd become a Catholic, and that became very difficult because George Norton didn't want him to have a Catholic funeral. And the third one outlived her, I'm glad to say. Only just.
Ariane asks whether she wrote campaigning tracts as well.
Yes, I think really her best writings now are her tracts. She wrote a terribly good letter to the Queen. Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837, the year after the case for adultery, which was 1836. And immediately Lord Melbourne, his attention was focused entirely on the young Queen. And I think Caroline was very jealous. I mean, she was wrecked by the case, and Melbourne was Prime Minister, and, being a lovely fatherly mentor to the lovely young Queen. Caroline used to refer to her in her letters as the royal girl, sort of sneering. But she did write a letter to the Queen talking about what women had done in history, how good queens had been, and appealing to her and saying, in a country where a woman is a sovereign, can't women have more rights? So she did. And when there was a terrible incident when Queen Victoria was the subject of an assassination attempt outside Buckingham Palace, she wrote her a poem of sort of condolence. And other, quite a lot of campaigning pamphlets.
Was she responsible? Another guest asks, of any legislation?
Well, I think she played her part. I think she said of herself, she'd been one of the little hinges on which the great doors of justice turn. And I think that's accurate. she certainly played her part lobbying. Later, the Married Woman's Property Act, she was actually dead, but she lobbied before. And the Matrimonial Causes Bill, really divorce, she also played her part lobbying for women's property rights to be respected. But people could always refer to her case, you see. They'd say, of course, we must change the law about Paul Caroline Norton and her children, you know. So I think in two ways, she helped change the law.
Christina Dykes has asked a question, which I hope she won't mind if I adapt slightly. You're a recipient of the club's Lifetime Achievement Award for biography. When you were writing this book, did you think, I'm writing a biography, I'm writing a history, or do you not think in those terms?
I don't think exactly in those terms. It's afterwards that I mean, when I first wrote biography in 1969, biography was not as highly regarded as it should be. And I spent quite a lot of time in sort of speeches and lectures saying, without biography, there'd be no history, you know, which I feel very strongly. I think biography, probably due to the efforts of people like University of Buckingham, the Biographers Club, I think biography is much better regarded now. I wasn't the first over there. I would say Cecil Woodham Smith, Florence Nightingale, or perhaps. And my mother was very early with her Queen Victoria, which was 1964. 1964, thank you. The biographers helped me. And I was 69, but I think we were, if I can say this without sounding conceited, I think we did do our bit by believing strongly in the importance of biography and writing readably. You know, it's all very well saying biographies makes up history, but if you can't read it, you know, you can whistle.
Good. Thank you very much, Antonia. I know you need to get away, so I'm going to hand back to Jane now to say thanks on behalf of all of us. Jane.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Well, Antonia, thank you so much. That was a fascinating conversation, fascinating discussion. And good luck with your next project, which we're not allowed to know what it is.
Jane, can I ask you what you're writing?
I'm ashamed to say I haven't got, I'm in that awful stage when I've, you know, just finished a book and haven't got another one on the go, which I find a very uncomfortable state of mind. But you're probably better organized than that and always do have another project.
It's just my book's been out longer than yours.
But thank you very much, because it was entertaining and instructive and a wonderful evening. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. I love talking about biography and history.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Is it there?